You ready? Okay, the top of Nun Testament Aleph.
Okay, getting there.
Now, the Mishnah says, if you have a drainage gutter that somebody puts on their property, the water is going down into somebody else's courtyard, but it was there for a while, and so you get a chazaka if it was if the other person with the chutzer did not protest according to the Rashbam. They didn't protest for 3 years. So there's the chazaka is a claim that the right to use it had been given to the owner of the drainage gutter. So this was in contrast in the Mishnah to the case of the marzev. The marzev was there's a spout at the very edge of this pipe, of this gutter pipe. And we said that the spout, there's no chazaka with respect to the spout. So we said 3 different explanations as to how there's no chazaka with respect to the spout. Either that the direction that the spout faces doesn't have a chazaka, but there's a chazaka that you can leave it there in some direction. Or that the length of the spout doesn't have a chazaka. If it's very long, part of it can be chopped off, but at least some of it has to remain. Or the third explanation was that there's no chazaka in terms of the right of the person who owns the courtyard is allowed to build underneath it, even though the spout itself is going to remain. So we're contrasting the maskila, the drainage gutter. We say that in the way in which a spout does not have a chazaka, maskila does have a chazaka. So bishlam shapir. So the first 2 explanations, I understand that the drainage gutter, the person in the courtyard can't chop off any part of the gutter and can't change the direction of the gutter. But according to the opinion that the way in which a spout doesn't have a chazaka is that the person in the courtyard can build underneath the spout. So why wouldn't the person in the courtyard be allowed to build underneath the drainage gutter? What harm is it going to do to the drainage gutter if he builds underneath it? So why should it be a difference? So what difference does it make to the owner of the drainage gutter if the person in the courtyard underneath is building some sort of a structure underneath it? So we say that we're talking about where the maskila itself is made out of stones. It's not made out of wood, it's made out of stones, and therefore it can become eroded if there's going to be a lot of knocking around and hammering underneath. So the person who owns the drainage gutter can say that I don't want my wall. We're referring to it as a wall because it's such a sturdy object. It's made out of stone. I don't want it to get ruined if there's going to be a lot of banging and knocking underneath. So that's the reason why it wouldn't be permitted in the case of the maskila. So here we have a nudin. Sinor, if you have, let's say, a gutter pipe, which is so one person owns a house and he has a gutter pipe at the edge of the house, and it's draining out the water. It's pouring out the water into the courtyard of his fellow. And now the person who owns the roof in which the gutter pipe is coming out wants to close it up. So the person in the courtyard can say, no, I'm depending upon that water. I mean, it's not going to be very clean water, but it's water which is still usable in terms of feeding his animals. The same way that you gained and acquired a chazaka over time, that you have the right to assert that you have a chazaka to pour out water into my courtyard. So I also have acquired a chazaka, says the person who owns the courtyard, that I have the right to the water that's pouring out from your roof because I'm feeding it, I'm using it to feed my animals. Okay. So Rabbi Yoshia, who is the son of Rabbi Chama, Rabbi Yoshia says, this makes sense to me. I agree with that halacha. I agree with this halacha that the owner of the courtyard has the right to stop the owner of the roof from closing up is a gutter pipe. Rabbi Chama, who is the father of Rabbi Yoshia, he says, no, I don't agree. I think that the only chazaka was acquired by the owner of the gutter pipe, but not by the owner of the courtyard to have the right to the water. So also Shaila Rabbi Bisa. So they asked the grandfather. They asked Rabbi Chama's father, who is Rabbi Oshia's grandfather. His name is Rabbi Bisa. So they asked Rabbi Bisa, what do you think? So Amalumi Akev, it's Rabbi Bisa, who became part of this intergenerational conversation, said that the owner of the courtyard does have the right to prevent the owner of the gutter pipe from closing it up. So Kari Aleh, Rami Bar Chama, so Rami Bar Chama said, this is such a beautiful sight. You have the grandfather, you have the son, and you have the grandson all conversing in Torah together. So he applied the pasuk to this trio of Ve'achuta mishulash lo b'meira yinasek. That when you have a three-plied cord, it's not going to break so easily. Rabbi Oshia, this is a reference to Rabbi Oshia, Ben Osha, Rabbi Chama, the son of Rabbi Chama, Ben Osha, Rabbi Bisa. And interestingly, the Rashbam says the idea of achuta meshulash is that it's the first and the third link in the chain that kind of causes the chain to remain sturdy, because we see that the grandson agreed with the grandfather that the owner of the courtyard is allowed to prevent the closing of the gutter pipe, even though the father was in a disagreement. So that goes to show that the learning of the grandfather was persevered 2 generations later with the learning and the opinion that was shared by his grandson. Tosfos has a different comment over here. Tosfos says the idea of achuta mishulash is you can have 3 generations in which the grandfather, the son, and the grandson all learn Torah, but that's not necessarily a guarantee that the Torah is never going to break off in the future unless they're all learning together. So he says the beauty of this situation was that the grandfather, the son, and the grandson were all learning together. They were all sharing Torah together. Okay, Sulam HaMitzri Ein Lo Chazaka. If you have a very small ladder, so Reuven puts his small ladder in Shimon's property. Shimon doesn't really care about a small ladder. So the fact that he never protested over a 3-year period does not give Reuven the right to assert that he acquired a chazaka. That's what the Mishnah says. So what is an example of a very small Egyptian style ladder? So if it doesn't have even 4 rungs. Like, you sometimes have a tiny little ladder that you keep in your garage so you can, maybe go up it in order to get something from the upper cabinets, a step ladder. You're retrieving something from like a high cabinet in your kitchen or something. So this type of a small, teeny tiny ladder that's easily knocked around and moved around, people don't really care about so much. So the fact that Reuven placed that with less than 4 rungs in Shimon's property does not cause him to acquire a chazaka. Kalona mitzvahs ein lo chazaka v'chulei. So Ma'ishna. So now we ask a question. When it comes to yes,
then he can get a chazaka.
if he has a gutter, what we said a maskila, if he has a gutter pipe, so then he can get a chazaka from leaving on his gutter pipe for 3 years. Okay, so and claiming that he was given or sold the right to keep it there. So Ma'ishna Gabi Sulam, why is it that with respect to the ladders, the 2 different cases of the ladders, so we said that a small ladder, mitzri, there's no chazaka, but if it's a larger ladder, a tsuris ladder, so then you do get a chazaka. So why is it that we give it specifications? When it comes to the ladder, the Mishnah itself doesn't tell you the difference between a small ladder and a large ladder. But when it comes to the windows, where we say that with a small window, if you open up a small window, you can't get a chazaka. But with a large window, a tsuris window, you do get a chazaka. So the Mishnah tells you what's a small ladder, what's a small window. A small window is where a person's head would not fit inside of the opening of the window. So we give specifications, but we don't give specifications with respect to the ladder. So So the answer is because Rabbi Yehuda says that even if you have a very small window, if it has a frame around it, so then you can gain a chazaka. So because of the fact that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with the entire distinction between small and large with respect to the window. So then, since Rabbi Yehuda comes along, we have to explain what it is that he's arguing about. What size is it that he's arguing about, as opposed to the case of the ladder where there's no disagreement. So here, there's a disagreement between the Rashbam and the Tosfos as to exactly what type of window we're talking about at this stage in the Gemara. According to the Rashbam, we're talking about with respect to a chalon suri. We said that with respect to a large window, the person who opens up the window is able to acquire a chazaka. Now we're distinguishing when is he able to acquire the chazaka, when not. According to Tosfos, this discussion in the Gemara right now is talking about the small window. because he says if you're talking about a large window, with a large window, you can always acquire a chazaka. But we'll go with the Rashbam. So Rashbam says that with respect to the large window, it depends. If the window is erected for less than 4 amos from the ground, from the floor of the person's house, so then there is a chazaka, because the neighbor would presumably mind that this person, when they're walking along the side of their floor, they're going to look out the window and they're going to see what's going on in the neighbor's property. So if they don't protest, there'll be a chazaka. In fact, because they have the right to protest, that there's a window that this neighbor who built the window is always going to be able to look out. Higher than even though, according to the way the Rashbam is learning it, it's a large window, almost ain't no chazaka, because a person is not going to look out a window that is more than 8 feet higher than the floor of his house. And in fact, therefore, a neighbor wouldn't be able to protest, because what is that to protest about? He's not suffering any harm, because the person who owns the house with the window is not going to be able to look out the window. Rabbi Eli disagrees with Rabbi Zera, and he says, no, even if the large window is more than 4 amos from the floor, is the person who builds the window is still not entitled to a chazaka. Limchos, and the neighbor has the right to protest. So the question is, so this is an interesting thing. So he says that he agrees that if it is lamala, both of them agree. Both of them agree that there's no chazaka, meaning both Rabbi Zera and Rabbi Eloi say that if the window is more than 4 amos from the ground, there is no chazaka that can be acquired. But the distinction between them is that according to Rabbi Zera, the neighbor is not allowed to protest, but according to Rabbi Eloi, the neighbor is allowed to protest. Okay, now why is it that he's allowed to protest? He's allowed to protest because he's worried about hezekriya, that the person who built the window more than 4 amos from the floor will be able to take a stool, stand on top of the stool, and then he'll be able to perch himself higher than Dalet Amos and look out the window. So that's the reason why the neighbor is allowed to protest, according to Rabbi Eloi. Yeah. Okay.
Because my understanding is he's building it up there so that he can get light into his house.
No, we're not talking about that per se. We're talking about a window that a person is going to use for purposes of surveying their land. They have orchards, they have vineyards, and they need to be able to check to make sure that nobody is stealing anything. So even though they're not necessarily going to be looking at on a regular basis, they're not going to be able to look necessarily into their neighbor's home, but they'll be able to see like far away, because this sort of opens up a vista since it's high up. So they'll be able to check on their vineyards and their orchards and stuff like that. That's the assumption, and you'll see why I'm saying that in just a moment. So so it seems maybe that these two Amoraim are arguing about whether a person has a right to protest what their neighbor is doing when they're not really losing out, if it's just sour grapes. Tamar Sava Kofin, that according to Rabbi Zera, we do force a person to allow an accommodation that doesn't harm him, and that's why the neighbor can't protest. Umar Sava Ein Kofin. Rabbi Eli says, no, even though the neighbor is not harmed, he still has the right to protest. So we say, no, the Kuliyama Kofin. We would never allow a person to protest if they're not going to be harmed, then it's just going to be sour grapes and prevent the person who's building the window from getting the benefit of the window. The reason why Rabbi Eloi says that the neighbor has the right to protest, even though the window is higher than Dalet Amos, is because the Amalei Zinin the Musva Shashifa Tutach, because sometimes you're going to place a bench underneath where the window is, and you're going to stand on the bench, and then you'll be able to see into the neighbor's property, and that's why the neighbor has the right to protest. Even though Rabbi Eloi agrees that there wouldn't be any kind of a chazaka in this case, but there still would be the right to protest. How they also the coming to Rabbi Ami, somebody came in front of Rabbi Ami where it was this type of a situation where the person asked Rabbi Ami, would I be allowed to make a large window higher than Dalet Amos when my neighbor doesn't want me to? So Shadri the coming to Rabbi Abba Bamamo. Rabbi Ami sent the question to Rabbi Abba Bamamo, but he gave Rabbi Abba Bamamo some advance notice and told him how to paskin. So Amalei, so he said to Rabbi Abba Bamamo, Avilei Rabbi Eloi. You should paskin like Rabbi Eloi that the person has no right to build a window if the neighbor is protesting. So Shmuel, but Shmuel said that's only if there is reason to look out the window to survey the person's properties from far away. But if the window is only being opened up for purposes of getting in aura, of getting in some light inside of the house, where the person has no need to look out the window, they're just using the window basically to receive illumination in their house. So in such a case, even if the person builds a tiny little window, this is going to cause the person to have a chazaka. Why is it going to cause them to have a chazaka? Because a person always needs the illumination. They always need the illumination. So since it is being done as something which is going to be permanent, as opposed to, a window that's being opened up for other purposes, that's not necessarily needed on a permanent basis. Therefore, this is something where the neighbor does have the right to be mocheh, and therefore, if he wasn't mocheh, we can say that it was something that was done with his permission and with his blessing, and therefore a chazaka would be acquired in such a case. Okay, Mishnah. The person who builds who builds a window for purposes of getting light to come into his house, because this window is going to be there forever. So therefore, the neighbor has the right to be mocheh. If the neighbor was not mocheh, then a chazaka would be created, and the individual who made the window, even if it's a teeny tiny window, would be allowed to keep that window forever. Now, next Mishnah says, Aziza tefach, that sometimes you build a projection that goes, let's say you have a wall between your house and your neighbor's house, and then you put a projection on top of the wall. So it's like a ledge in which you'd be able to like put things on the ledge, hang laundry, whatever it is. Haziz tefach. So yeshlo chazaka. So if it is a tefach long and the neighbor doesn't protest, that's a significant ledge, a significant projection, and therefore the person who builds it would acquire a chazaka. Next stop, we're now on Nun Tes Amud Beis Yaakov, the Yachol Limchos. And therefore it follows that the neighbor would, namely the Baal HaChatzer, during, let's say, the first 3 years when the projection had been put out, so the neighbor has the right to protest. That's how the Rashbam learns. There are different ways of learning this line, but we'll go with the Rashbam. So the Rashbam says, so during the 3-year period, the neighbor has the right to be mocheh, but then after 3 years, the neighbor doesn't have the right to be mocheh, because at that point in time, the owner of the wall acquired a chazaka. If it's less than a tefach, if it's less than 1 tefach wide, the projection is less than 1 tefach wide, nobody cares about that. So therefore, the neighbor is not going to be mocheh, has no right to be mocheh, because it's not going to create any harm from his perspective. And if he wants to chop it off at any point in time, he could chop it off, because there's no chazaka. The one who builds the tiny little projection has the right to build it up until less than a tefach, but he does not acquire a chazaka. So if there is some need that the neighbor has to build in that area, and by building up in that area, he's going to have to knock off the projection, at that point in time, he has the right to knock off the projection. But if he doesn't have a need, so then that's sour grapes to protest. So up until that point, he doesn't have the right to protest. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yasi, Amar Rabbi Mani, Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Mani. We know that the person who ultimately said this was Rabbi Mani. Question as to who quoted Rabbi Mani. Was it Rabbi Yasi or was it Rabbi Yaakov? But either way, it was Rabbi Mani who said. So Rabbi Mani said, Hexik b'tefach, hexik b'dalet. He said that if a person who put out the projection for 1 tefach, 1 tefach is like 3.5 inches or so. So then he has a chazaka that the projection can be 4 tefachim. So that sounds a little bit unreasonable, because if the neighbor didn't mind a tefach, which was a projection which was 1 tefach, 3.5 inches, who says that he wouldn't mind a projection which is 4 times that size, which is about 14 inches? Maybe he wouldn't mind. So my comer, so what in the world is going on over here? Why should a chazaka that was acquired for 1 tefach translate into a chazaka to put out a projection which is 4 tefachim wide? That seems like a lot. So Amar Abaye Hachik Kamer. So Abaye says no. What it means is, if there's a projection that the owner of the wall will put up that has the length of 4 tefachim and the width of 1 tefach, so we say that once it has the length of 4 tefachim, which is already a makom chashuv, so then the person has the right to build out if there's a width already of 1 tefach, so the width can also be extended for 4 tefachim. So essentially, if he has a rectangle, which is 4 tefachim long and 1 tefach wide, that entitles him to a square of 4 tefachim long and 4 tefachim wide. Hexik rochav tefach b'meshach arba, hexik rochav arba, because he already has a chazaka
basically, as the Rashbam explains, with respect to a makom chashuv, once he has a makom chashuv of a 4 tefachim wide and 1 tefach wide, 4 tefachim long and 1 tefach wide. So then we allow him to just round it off or square it off. So it could be 4 by 4, right? You heard of a 4 by 4. So you go to like Home Depot, you get a 4 by 4. So this is like the makar. So pakas mitefach ein lo chazaka. If it's less than a tefach, so then you're not entitled to, then there's no chazaka that's acquired by the owner of the wall who simply extended a projection to go forth into the neighbor's property, and it was less than a tefach, less than 3.5 inches, so people aren't makpid, and they wouldn't be mocha, and therefore there's no chazaka. And the neighbor has no right to be mocha, because it's not causing him any harm. So Amrafuna Loshana Balagag Balachotzer. So Afuna says that the one who is who owns the wall, let's say he has, we call the roof. He has the roof that he's extending out from his roof, a little projection, and now the projection is on top of it is dangling over the property of the neighbor who owns the courtyard. So he can't prevent the person in the courtyard from like hanging something on this tiny projection. But about Balachotzer, the Balachotzer does have the right to protest if the Balagag is going to go and use the projection, because then he's going to look into the courtyard. Balachotzer Balagag Yachalimkos. Rav Yudah, however, says no. Amafila Balachotzer Balagag and Yachalimkos. He says that the owner of the Chotzer is not allowed to protest the owner of the Gag from using his projection, from using the ledge, because it's sour grapes. So what is it that they're arguing about? Maybe they're arguing about the right to privacy, as to whether somebody is harmed by one person looking into the other one's courtyard. The Marsav Shmei Hezek, that according to Rav Yehuda, who says that according to Rav Huna, who says that the Baal HaChotzer is allowed to prevent the Baal Hagag from using the ledge, so he's worried that the Baal Hagag is going to look into the courtyard. And Rabbi Yehuda, who says that it's not a problem in either direction, holds that we don't really care if the one who has the roof where he extended the projection and now is overlooking the neighbor's courtyard, if he uses the projection, he looks into the courtyard, no big deal. So we say, no, of course it's a big deal. We paskin that at the beginning of the Masechta. That there is damage that's caused. It is a thing to stop somebody from invading another person's privacy. So, of course, both of them hold by that principle. Shiny Hacha, the reason why Rabbi Yehuda is makel over here is the Amar Le Tashmishta Lochazi. He says, I have a ledge. The owner of the roof says, I put out a ledge that's less than a tefach. I can't really use it for anything. I'm not able to walk on top of it because it's this teeny tiny little area. So it's not as if I'm going to be sitting on top of it. Lamai chazi, what is it that it's good for? It's good that I'm going to hang up my laundry there every once in a while. So when I hang something up, I could face my head in the other direction, and then I can hang it up. And therefore, I'm never going to look into your courtyard. And the other shita, namely Rafuna, whom he paskin like, who says, no, he's not allowed to use it. Amalei Zidman to be sus. He says that no, sometimes you're going to be nervous if you're climbing up your wall to hang something that you're going to fall or something if you're not looking carefully at what you're doing. So therefore, you're going to be looking in the direction of where you are placing the item. And if you're looking in that direction, you're going to be looking towards my property. And therefore, you're going to be looking upon my property. And if anybody says, oh, he's a ganav because he's looking into somebody else's property, which he's not supposed to do, and nobody is going to want to put themselves in that position. So therefore, the person in the courtyard wouldn't have to worry about it. The answer is no, because the person who owns the roof would be able to make an excuse. So I was afraid of falling. So since he has the ability to make the excuse, I was afraid of falling, he has a justification for looking in the courtyard, and therefore the person in the courtyard will say, I don't want you to have that justification. So just don't hang things up on that little projection, because this way my privacy won't be invaded. And that's the explanation for the opinion of Afuna. So the way we paskin, when we say in the Mishnah, Ein Yachol Limchos, all it means is that the person who put out the ledge that's less than a tefach has no right to protest when the person in the courtyard is going to use his small ledge. But it doesn't mean that the person who put out the ledge who's the owner of the roof, actually has the right to use the ledge. Okay, next Mishnah. Lo yiftach adam chalanosav l'chatzer hashutfim. If you have your windows and you're opening up windows, you're not allowed to, unless you're given explicit permission, or they pay you, or you pay something, and that they and they sell to you this permission. But otherwise, a person has no right to open up their windows to face into a courtyard of partners, even though pashtus is, as the Rashbam says over here at the beginning, even though this person is one of the two partners, and he shares a courtyard together with somebody else. And when he's in the courtyard, the other person has to be careful to not engage in private activities, because he's going to be seen. Nonetheless, despite the fact that it's a shared courtyard, the person, when he opens up a window in his house into the shared courtyard, is not allowed to open up a window in the direction of the shared courtyard, because the other person who shares the courtyard will feel that this is going to be an invasion of privacy, because now he has to worry about, not only when he's in the courtyard with the person, but even when he's alone in the courtyard, that maybe the neighbor is looking at him through his house. If somebody bought a house in, let's say, an adjacent courtyard, and now they want to create an opening from that courtyard into into this courtyard, so they're not allowed to open up an opening from that house. They can't have like an additional opening to get from the adjacent courtyard into this courtyard, because once there's an additional opening, so that creates a new direction of entry where more people can enter into this area, and it's going to therefore be more of an invasion of the private space of the person in the first courtyard, who does not necessarily want there to be more openings and more people coming into the courtyard. So if a person builds a second story on top of their house, he's not allowed to open up a new opening into the upper story, because that also is going to create more traffic going into this shared courtyard. That now he has another story, so he's able to create a passageway for more people to come inside, and there'll be more people in the general courtyard area, so it'll be an invasion of privacy. Rather, if he wants, he can simply take this space that he already has. Let's say that he has a certain amount of height and length and width of his house, so he's allowed to create a division in the middle of the house where he splits it up. So he has an apartment in the inside of the house, an apartment on the outside of the house, and then within the house, he creates more passageways. That's not a problem, because he's allowed to use the space of his house. He can fill up his entire house with residents. He's just not allowed to create a second story unless there's special permission. Similarly, he can create a split level within his house. If he has a 12-foot, let's say he has 15-foot ceilings, so he can make he has a 15-foot ceiling in his house, so he can make a ceiling in the middle, let's say 8 feet high. So now he has one story which is 8 feet high, and another second story which is 7 feet high, and then he can have like a ladder or an opening which enables people to go from the lower story to the upper story and have additional people living in the upper story, because he's just using the space that he already has. Gemara, why is it that the Mishnah goes out of his way to say a person in his house is not allowed to open up a window into a shared courtyard space? He's also not allowed to open up his house, even if it wouldn't be a shared courtyard, even if it would just be a courtyard that belongs solely to his fellows. So he say, "Let me buy a comer." So he say, "No, he's saying this is a chiddush. That's obviously you're not allowed to just open up your window to look into the private courtyard that belongs to your fellow and then look at his private affairs. Obviously that you can't do. But you might say that if it is a courtyard that belongs to two partners, to Amalei, so, and especially if the owner of the house is one of the partners, which seems to be the understanding in the Maskana, to Amalei sof hakabais isnui minai, because then I might think that the owner of the house who's opening up the window will say to the other fellow in the courtyard, "Look, when you're in the courtyard anyway, you share it with me, and you have to be careful to not engage in as particularly private activities when you and I are together in the courtyard. So what's the big deal if I also, since you have to protect your privacy? What's the big deal if I open up an additional window for my house?" So Kamash Malan, it is a big deal to Amalei, because the neighbor can say, up until now, that when we were together in the courtyard, so then I had to protect my privacy. But when you weren't there, so then I didn't have to guard what I was doing because I didn't have to worry that you're watching me. But now I have to be careful. Even when you're inside the house, you might be looking at me, and therefore I have to. And it's going to invade my privacy even further than what it was beforehand. Okay, fine. There was a case where a person opened up his windows, Eddie, to the Chatzar HaShutfin, to the courtyard that belonged to partners, the courtyard that he shared with somebody else. So he came in front of Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Yossi to find out if this window that he had opened up was considered to be legitimate or not. Because he claimed that this was perfectly that it was perfectly fine. He didn't have it for 3 years, but he had it like for a couple of weeks or so. But he claimed that since the neighbors didn't protest, the other neighbors in the courtyard didn't protest, so he claimed that he should have a chazaka immediately. Because it's such an invasion of privacy that if the neighbors really were offended, or if they felt that it was illegitimate, then they should have protested immediately. The fact that they didn't protest immediately should indicate that he should have a chazaka right away. So Amalo and Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yossi happen to agree with that point of view. He's even cited earlier as agreeing to that point of view on Daf Mem Aleph and Aleph. He's one of those Tanoim who is of the opinion that a person can acquire a chazaka by engaging in an offensive use right away if the neighbors didn't protest. So he said, hey, don't worry about it. You have acquired a chazaka. But that was only the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi. When they came in front of Rabbi Chia said, you know what? You got to patachta. You went through all of the trouble of opening up the window. Now go through the trouble of closing the window because you didn't acquire a chazaka at all. Because you need as the Rashbam says, you need a 3-year period plus a taina that you acquired the chazaka was given to you as a gift. You need at least a 3-year period in order to be able to acquire the chazaka, and this was not 3 years; it was right away. So Rav Nachman says that's only to open up a window. But listam the altar have a chazaka, but if it is a question where a person, let's say, already had a window that was open for 3 years and they could have had a chazaka on the window, but then their neighbor built a wall like right next to it, blocking all of the light from the window, and the person who had the window didn't protest. So if they didn't protest, so then they have sacrificed essentially their chazaka, and now the person who built the wall has the right to insist that, since I have built the wall, and this person was quiet and didn't stop me from building the wall, so a person would not protest the building, would not allow the building of a wall right next to his window unless it was something which was legitimate. So therefore, the person who built the wall is now entitled to the wall and is entitled to really stop the other individual from asserting a right to having a window that will not be blocked by a wall. Because even right away, where it's like the next day, a person is never going to allow their neighbor to block their light by building a wall unless it was legitimate, where they had acquired the right, or there is some good legitimate right that the person had. So the fact that the one with the window didn't protest showed that it was legitimate for the other one to close up their space with a wall, and then the one with the window can't complain about it afterwards. We'll just go quickly to the Mishnah. They're not allowed to create additional passageways because then more people are going to come in, and that's going to invade the privacy of their neighbor. My time, because there are more people that are now going to come into the courtyard. So Ema Sefer, so why then in the Sefer do we say that we allow a person to make a split level of their house or to divide their house in half and to have more people living in their house, because now they're going to divide their house into 2 different apartments? Isn't that going to create more residents who are going to come into the chutzner? Yeah, that's fine, because we're not talking about building additional space. If you build additional space, so the neighbor has the right to complain, because that means you're going to have additional stories, like make a giant skyscraper or apartment building, so more people are going to come in and the neighbor can't complain. But if it's the same amount of space, the person is just building a ceiling in the middle of their space, or they're creating an inner apartment and an outer apartment by building a wall in the middle of their space. So as long as they're just using the space they already had, Mafuna, that's fine. It means that you either split the space horizontally in half, or you built a loft, you built a loft on top of the space by just having a ceiling in the middle of the space that you already had, creating an upper story, but not adding on to your space. So a person has the right to utilize the space that they already have to the fullest, even if it means that they're going to create a second apartment. But as long as they're not building out at all, then that's perfectly legitimate, even though more people are going to occupy the same amount of space. And that brings us to the Mishnah and to the end of today's daf. Okay.